Now that you know that how the money supply is controlled by the Federal Reserve, let's see how a change in the money supply and the demand for money will impact investment. As you may remember, investment is one of the four things that impact GDP. So changes in the supply of money and the demand for money have an impact on GDP through investment. The relationship between the money supply and GDP is the Federal Reserve changes the money supply. This causes the interest rates to change. When the interest rate change, then firms change their investment habits. And when firms change their investments, GDP changes. What happens to GDP when the Federal Reserve increases the money supply? The following questions need to be answered. What happens to the money supply curve? What happens to the interest rate? What happens to investment? What happens to GDP as investment changes? The neoclassical theory of investment states that investment by firms is based upon the interest rate. Specifically, the neoclassical theory of investment says that when the interest rate increases, the amount of investment by firms decreases. Let's take a minute to look at our graph. First off, on the x-axis, or the back and forth axis, we have investment, and investment increases as we move from left to right. Our vertical or up and down axis is the interest rate, and as we move from the bottom towards the top, interest rate increases. According to the neoclassical view of investment, the interest rate determines the amount of investment. In this case, we have an interest rate I, which determines the amount of investment, capital I. Notice that this is an inverse relationship. So as I increases, investment decreases, and as I decreases, investment increases. The neoclassical model of investment, as you may remember, is that the interest rate determines the amount of investment. On the slide we have two graphs. On the left side we have a graph showing the relationship between the supply of money and the demand for money. The place where the demand for money crosses the supply of money gives us an equilibrium interest rate. The graph on the right represents the relationship between the interest rate and the investment. Thus, if we know the equilibrium interest rate from the supply and demand for money, then we are able to determine the amount of investment that is made in the economy. The neoclassical model of investment has some interesting implications when we want to analyze the policies of the Federal Reserve. Let's look at an example of the changes in the money supply. Let's look at the relationship between investment and money supply. The Federal Reserve increases the money supply, the interest rate decreases as a result of the increase in the money supply. The decrease in the interest rate causes investment to increase. The Federal Reserve increases the money supply. The interest rate decreases as a result of the increase in the money supply. This decrease in the interest rate causes investment to increase. Let's then see what happens when the Federal Reserve decreases the money supply. The Federal Reserve decreases the money supply. The interest rate increases as a result of the decrease in the money supply. The increase in the interest rate causes investment to decrease. Let's see how this looks on our graph. The money supply shifts to the left. This causes the interest rate to increase and investment to decrease. John Maynard Keynes came up with an idea for the liquidity trap. The liquidity trap is the idea that there might be a situation where changes in the money supply could not influence the interest rate and by extension GDP and unemployment. Keynes mentioned this idea to help him justify the necessity of increasing government spending. Suppose that the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the banking system. When the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the banking system, the money supply increases. On the graph, this translates to a shift to the right of the money supply curve. When the money supply curve shifts to the right, the equilibrium interest rate decreases from I0 down to I1. According to the neoclassical model of investment, the amount of investment will increase from I0 to I1. Keynes was aware of the neoclassical view of investment, but he argued that there may be a situation where the demand for money is completely horizontal. Let's look back at our graphs. The graph on the left represents the supply and demand for money. In our previous graph, the demand curve was downward sloping, indicating that high interest rates caused individuals to hold less money, and low interest rates caused individuals to hold more money. Keynes said what happens is when the demand for money doesn't depend on the interest rate, the demand will be fixed at a certain interest rate. The way Keynes' assumption is drawn here is to have the demand for money to be perfectly horizontal or flat at some interest rate. Let's see what happens when the central bank increases the money supply. Suppose the Federal Reserve buys bonds to increase the money supply. As you may remember, buying of bonds causes the supply of money to increase from Q0 to Q1. However, notice that even though the money has increased, there is no impact on the interest rates. Since the interest rate does not decrease, there is no incentive for firms to invest. Since there is no increased investment, there is no increased consumption of capital goods, and GDP does not increase. This situation is known as a liquidity trap, because even though there are increases in the money supply, there are no decreases in the interest rate and no increases in either investment or GDP. Let's look at the impact of changes in the money supply on investment and GDP. What happens when the money supply is increased? The Federal Reserve increases the money supply. The increase in the money supply causes the interest rate to decrease. The decrease in the interest rate causes an increase in investment, and an increase in investment causes GDP to increase. Let's look at this in a graphical format. The Federal Reserve increases the money supply. The increase in the money supply causes the interest rate to decrease. The decrease in the interest rate causes an increase in investment. The increase in investment causes aggregate demand to increase. So our price level goes up, and our GDP increases from GDP 0 to GDP 1. Before looking at the impact of a decrease in the money supply on GDP, let's go through the steps in a written format. First, the Federal Reserve decreases the money supply. Second, the decrease in the money supply causes the interest rate to increase. 3. The increase in the interest rate causes an increase or decrease in investment. The decrease in investment causes GDP to decrease. Let's see what happens when the Federal Reserve decreases the money supply. First, the Federal Reserve decreases the money supply. The decrease in the money supply causes an increase in the interest rate. The increase in the interest rate causes investment to drop from I0 to I1. Since investment is a component of aggregate demand, a decrease in investment will cause aggregate demand to shift to the left, causing the price level to drop and causing the GDP to drop from GDP 0 to GDP 1. Now that we've looked at the impact of changes on the money supply on investment, let's look at the impact of the changes in the demand for money on investment. Let's see what happens when the demand for money shifts to the right. First, the demand for money shifts to the right. Second, the shift in the demand for money causes the interest rate to increase. The increase in the interest rate causes investment to decrease. Let's look at this in a graphical format. First off, the demand for money shifts to the right. The shift in the demand for money to the right causes the interest rate to increase. The increase in the interest rate causes investment to decrease. So our investment decreases from I sub O to I1. Let's look at the impacts of decreased demand for money on investment. The demand for the money shifts to the left. The shift in the demand for money to the left causes the interest rate to decrease. The decrease in the interest rate causes investment to increase. Let's take a look at this in a graphical format. First off, the demand for money shifts to the left. The shift in the demand for money to the left causes the interest rate to decrease. The decrease in the interest rate causes the investment to increase. So when our demand curve for money shifts to the left, the interest rate drops from I sub O to I sub 1. Then that causes investment to increase from I sub O to I sub 1. Let us analyze the idea of crowding out of investment by the government. Crowding out is the idea that excessive government borrowing will prevent the industry from being able to invest. In the long run, this will hurt the economy because it will lower GDP and, by extension, unemployment. Let's look and see what happens. If the government increases the interest rate to borrow more money, this will cause the demand for money to shift to the right. When the demand for money shifts to the right, interest rates will increase and causing investment to decrease. Remember that a decrease in investment will cause GDP to decrease as well. Some economists think that in the long run, the manipulation of the money supply will have no real impact on investment. Let's take a look and see what they're trying to get at. Let's see what happens to investment in the long run if the Federal Reserve increases the money supply. First, the Federal Reserve increases the money supply. Second, the interest rate decreases, causing investment to increase. However, more firms begin to demand more money, which causes the demand for money to shift to the right. The shift to the right of the demand for money causes the interest rate to increase. The increase in the interest rate causes the investment to decrease and the economy returns to its original state.